Welcome back. You're watching Business Today here on KTN News, and we're coming to you live from the University of Nairobi, where the Africa Trade and Economics Conference is happening. Now, we are intelligent stakeholders in this industry who know quite a bit about taking trade and economics in Africa to the next level. And now we are joined by Reka Kent, who is the owner of Redstone Consulting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Leadership does play a huge role as well.
In economies in Kenya, around the world, around Africa, because that is where our focus is right now. But tell us about traditional kind of leadership that we are having in Kenya today that is probably keeping economic growth at a very flat level.
Traditional leadership in Kenya, but also globally, it is very much of the leader at the top of the organization. So if you've got the triangle, the leader's there. And, that kind of has this concept of the leader as the superhero, with the superhero strength of making the decision, of driving the organization, providing direction. And that concept and that kind of structure is quite detrimental, not just to the leader itself, but also to the organization, to the business, and to people who work with them. And I'll tell you why. The reason is because it almost becomes a case of the individuals working in the organization. They stop thinking for themselves because they wait to be told what to do. And in the absence of that, it's almost like you have a group of lost puppies who don't know what to do and when to do it. So I think it's really important for us to shift that mindset. So instead of the leader being at the top of the organization, the leader being part of a team, creating a collaborative process, and creating, innovation through discussion and dialogue, as opposed to just feeling that they need to have the answer.
All right. So just picture it for us, maybe for us to be able to understand. When you talk about traditional leadership, kind of at the moment in a country like Kenya, for instance?
Yeah, I'm from the UK, so I moved to Kenya 4 years ago, and I think a lot of organizations are still very patriarchal. It's very hierarchical, where it's still about, the leader at the top, and it's still about breaking some of the structure in order for people to give feedback, to have those conversations upward. And there's a lot of clients that I've been working with where, one of the key things is, so I tend to want to get feedback from different people in the organization. And one of the key things that I hear a lot is, I can't give feedback to my leader, and, my leader's not listening. And I think that really gets in the way of performance. Because it's almost like, if I don't like something, I can't voice it, and therefore I can't do anything. Mm-hmm. So the employee becomes like a victim of the structure that it's in.
Right. All right. And so when we are looking at changing or switching the mindset, how do we go about it? Where do we that we are dealing with the kind of leadership where the person at the top be the one who wants to always be listened to, the one who wants to have the last word. So how do we turn this around?
Yeah. I think it has to start at the top. Yeah, I mean, as they say, it's easier, pushing a rock down a mountain as opposed to pushing it up. And one of the things, it's about changing the mindset. And I think if leaders are open to looking at another way, because I think a lot of leaders realize that the current process, the current method isn't working. And if they are open to looking at it in a different way about how do you, move away from the superhero complex and move into a place of listening and trusting. And I think that takes two things. I think the first thing is knowing that you don't have all the answers, and being okay with that. I think there's a thing that as a leader I have to have all the answers, which puts a lot of pressure on you as well. So being okay with the fact that I don't have all the answers. And the second thing is appreciating that that having ideas from more people is better than having ideas just from one person. You know, that concept of the sum is greater than the parts. I think if we start with that shift in mindset, I think it would really help.
All right, and you know, when we look at it generally, it has affected not just Kenyan companies, but companies around the world. And while we are seeing maybe countries in the developed world trying to turn this around, we still have a long way to go when it comes to our side of the world, because around Africa, maybe it's an African thing, one would actually say, that leadership is one of the most revered things ever. But then again, how do we deal with a generation where we're having a large youthful generation that wants to be involved in leadership decisions, but then they don't get a chance to do that? And how does that influence business development around the continent?
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between the private sector and the public sector as well. I think the more kind of commercial corporate organizations are a bit more in touch with what leadership needs to be doing, and is shifting more than, say, governmental organizations. And I guess they're probably more nimble, so able to change. But I think that it's not an overnight thing. And I think that the challenge at the minute is you've got the youth, the younger generation, and you know, you hear things like they're unemployable because the concept of you know, the 9 to 5, the job for life, you know, it's redundant now, you know, and things are changing so quickly. And you know, I think research shows that by the time somebody is 38, they would have had 10 jobs. You know, and that's a lot of jobs by the time you're 38. Right. It's almost like you're leaving somewhere every 2 years. You know, the average tenure is 3 years. So what does that mean for the organization? It means that, you know, what do you need to change in order to keep talent? And that's one of the key things here in the banking industry, in the telecoms, is how do you attract and retain key talent? And that's a challenge.
So what should be the
appropriate or period of time that one should work at a certain organization or company before they can transit into yet another job? Is it 8 months? Is it 2 years? Is it 4 years? How would you actually, because when you put it that some people at the age of 30 have 10 jobs, what would you say would be the turnaround time for somebody to transition from one job to the other?
I think it's really... and I think that's a difficult question, because I don't think there's a set amount of time. I mean, I think probably 5-10 years ago, you know, if you looked at somebody's CV and they had moved jobs every year, you would think, oh, what's wrong with this person? But now it's almost viewed like, oh, this person is, you know, hungry for growth, trying new things. And so, and I think it also depends on the sector. So, for example, the IT sector is a lot more dynamic, fast-paced than something like, you know, the working for a parastatal, for example. So the tenure will differ. Yes. So I don't think there's an average tenure, but I also think that the nature of how we work is changing. So if you look at flexible working, that's being, I mean, there's one of my clients at the moment who introduced it late last year, you know, the concept of flexible working, which is great, you know, and then also the concept of consulting and, you know, freelancing and doing more of that. I'm finding a lot more of the younger generation being a lot more entrepreneurial. I mean, there was a great entrepreneurs conference a couple of weeks ago, and the amount of energy and youth and graduates who are starting their new things is amazing.
All right.
Amazing.
All right. So how do we ensure that we actually is shifting the mindset when it comes to leadership skills and the kinds of leadership that we have today that is much more different from the traditional, you know, old school big boy kind of leadership?
I don't know, I think it's this concept of being a leader, you know, and I think we need to disassociate authority with leadership, because just because I'm in authority, it doesn't mean I'm the leader. And I think that I think everyone is a leader. You know, you look at teams, I mean, you look at the software and the IT industry in the States at the minute, it's booming. Why is it booming? Because the concept of everyone is leading, everyone is collaborating, working together, and it's just this dynamic, organic process And I think we don't have that here as such at the moment, especially with a lot of the larger organizations. So I think that what we need to do is break our current way of thinking and think about leadership very differently. Think about it from the perspective of how do we, how do we change and how do we just stop doing what we were doing and try something different? So I think that takes a level of openness, being open-minded about it, and reducing the levels of authority. I think there does need to be some structure, but how do we make that structure flexible, and how do we make our leaders open to listening to others?
All right. Paint a picture for us. We're having male-dominated leadership positions, and when you look at the females, or at least women in these positions, you'll probably be looking at just a few of them. And yet we've gone through the whole rhetoric of, women must take up leadership positions. And then when you hear from the women, it almost appears that there's not much interest for women to take up these positions. Is it because we are shying away from them, or is it that there's no interest in taking up leadership positions from the women's side of view?
It's interesting. I mean, 50% of the workforce is women, and I think only about 4 or 5% are in leadership positions, which is a sad reality, actually. And I think it's a number of different things. I think, maybe they're choosing not to. But also, if you look at the environment they're going into work in, it's a very male-dominated environment. And I think a lot of research now has suggested that actually women do, I think only about by 3 or 4%, make better leaders. Because there's certain skills and attributes that women do tend to have, the nurturing side and the ability to connect with individuals. But again, I think, is it choice, or is it just because it's the environment that they're in that they're not going up to those positions? And I think it's a bit of both.
All right. And going forward, you're just about to speak at this second session of the Africa Trade and Economics Conference. Where do you think that we should moment?
In terms of leadership?
Yes, in terms of leadership and business development.
I think it's new ways of thinking. I think if I was to say new ways of thinking and going back to basics, going back, at the minute, I think globally there's about 74 working definitions of the concept of leadership. That's a lot. It's confusing. Am I supposed to do this as a leader? Am I supposed to that? But I think it's about going back to the basics. One of the cornerstones of African philosophy is the Ubuntu philosophy, which is around living in communities. That's the basic premise of it, and working in collaboration. So how do we do more of that instead of the superhero complex? How do we create a community of leaders in the organization? That's the approach I would take.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Rekha Kent, who is the owner Redstone Consulting, talking to us about business and leadership and how much of a role collective leadership does play in driving economic development as well. And she's going to be among the speakers for the session that is coming up here at the Africa Trade and Economics Conference that is happening at the University of Nairobi Business School. So we've come to the of business today, and earlier we also did update you on how the Jubilee scorecard cabinet secretaries as well did give what has been achieved throughout the past 3 years of the Jubilee government. And since they came into power, there's been, of course, a lot of changes regarding appointments of different cabinet secretaries, and also what the role has been for them. Whether or not they have been able to put the allocated money to use is a question that we can only determine or even find answers to, depending on whether or not you are satisfied with the services that they are delivering to the people around the country. Well, my name is Joy Doreen Bira.